Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Mini Books Podcast with your host Gloria and Rogan, and today we are excited to dive into Special Book with You. We picked this one because it has really important lessons to share and we can't wait to talk about them. So let's get started.
Ever catch yourself making like a snap decision and then you're like, wait, why did I do that? Or maybe you fall for the same marketing tricks, even when you know you should be smarter than that.
Happens to the best of us.
Right. Well, that's what today's deep dive is all about. We're going to unpack all those hidden forces behind like our everyday choices, And to do that, we're diving headfirst into, you guessed it, thinking fast and slow.
Oh, a classic, a real game changer.
Totally. Daniel Kahneman, he kind of blew everyone's minds with this one. And get this, Kahneman, he's got this whole idea that there are two characters like duking it out in our heads all the time. He calls them System 1 and System 2.
Catchy, right.
Totally. So to help us navigate this whole world of like mental shortcuts and cognitive whatchamacallits, biases. I've got our expert on the line. Welcome. Let's jump right in. We've got these two systems, System 1, System 2. What's the deal? Why should we even care about this whole internal tug of war?
Well, it's funny you use the word tug of war because it really is this constant back and forth. But in terms of why we should care, well, it's like having this amazing framework for understanding how our minds actually work, So picture this, System 1. That's like your super fast, intuitive self, always on, running in the background, making those split-second judgments.
Okay. So like if I'm about to step into traffic and I jump back because there's a car coming.
Exactly. That's System 1, just reacting, keeping you safe. It's driven by emotion and instinct, really good at navigating the everyday.
Gotcha. So System 1, our inner autopilot, keeping us safe, making those quick decisions. So where does System 2 fit into all of this?
System 2, that's our friend who likes to overthink everything.
Oh, I know that friend.
Right? Slower, more deliberate, likes to weigh all the options, analyze every angle.
The pros, the cons.
Exactly. That's System 2 in action. But, and this is important, System 2, it gets tired. It's a little lazy, to be honest.
It's tough to argue with logic.
It is. So especially when we're tired or stressed, bombarded with information.
Which, let's be real, is like always.
Right. System 2 is like, nope, I'm taking a break. System 1, you're in charge.
So we've got our quick thinking, instinctual System 1 and our slower, more analytical System 2. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, honestly.
You'd think so, right? But it actually works pretty well most of the time.
I guess so. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
Exactly. And Kahneman, he uses this great anecdote about a chess master to kind of illustrate how this all plays out in the real world. Have you heard this one?
I think so. Is it the one where they're like watching a game and just know?
Yes. They see a street game happening and without even like pausing, they're like, white mates in 3.
And everyone's like, what? How?
Exactly. It seems like pure genius, like almost like magic, right? But as Kahneman points out, it's not actually magic. It's years and years of practice, pattern recognition. Their System 1 has just seen this board configuration thousands of times, so it just knows.
It's like that saying, expertise is recognizing a situation you've already encountered 1,000 times.
Exactly.
But doesn't that mean that even experts, they're relying on these mental shortcuts?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's a key part of Kahneman's argument. These mental shortcuts, these heuristics, they're generally super helpful, Allow us to make quick judgments without getting bogged down.
Otherwise, we'd never get anything done.
Right. But they also make us prone to biases, these predictable errors in our thinking that can lead to some, well, let's just say, interesting decisions.
And the crazy thing is, you can actually see this happening in the brain.
Right. Isn't that wild?
Hannibal talks about this study where they were tracking people's pupils while they were doing these mental tasks.
Yeah.
I got to admit, I was surprised they found anything there.
It is remarkable. But basically, they found that as the mental effort increased, the pupils dilated.
So like a little window into how hard the brain's working.
Exactly. But here's where it gets even weirder. If the task was too difficult, the pupils would actually constrict.
What?
Like the brain was hitting overload and just shutting down.
So it's like conserving energy, even if it means making a mistake.
It's wild, right? Our brains are constantly trying to find that balance between efficiency and accuracy.
It makes you wonder how often we're running on mental fumes, and we don't even realize it.
More often than we'd like to think, probably. And that's why understanding the interplay between these two systems, System 1 and System 2, it's so crucial.
Boy.
Because if we can start to recognize when we're susceptible to these biases, we can start to make more conscious, deliberate decisions, especially when it really matters.
Okay, so our brains, they love a good shortcut, even if it means, like, tossing logic out the window sometimes. Let's talk about some of those heuristics, those mental shortcuts. What are some, like, real-world examples of those things messing us up?
Well, one that we stumble over all the time is this thing called the availability heuristic.
The availability what now?
It's basically where we judge how likely something is to happen based on, like, how easy it is to think of examples of it.
Oh, okay. So, like, if I just watched, like, a super scary movie about a killer clown, suddenly I'm convinced they're hiding in every shadow.
Exactly.
Even though, like, realistically, the odds of that are super slim.
Exactly. Our brains, they latch on to those vivid emotional memories.
Killer clowns, yeah.
Right, and we give them way more weight than they deserve. Suddenly, our whole perception of risk is skewed.
It's like that saying, if it bleeds, it leads. We're hardwired for drama.
Totally. And because System 1 is all about creating a good story, even if it's based on, very little information,
Right.
it often just ignores base rates.
Base rates, like, remind me what that is again.
Oh, just like the actual statistical probability of something happening.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
statistically, you're way more likely to trip over your own feet than meet a killer clown, no matter how many scary movies you watched.
So true. Okay, so that brings us to that Tom W. study, right?
Yeah.
The one where people's stereotypes about certain jobs, it just, like, completely took over, even when the numbers didn't add up.
Exactly. So they had people read this vague description of Tom W.
And they had to guess what he studied, right?
Right. Sorry to interrupt you guys. If you're enjoying this podcast, then don't forget to check out our official YouTube channel, Mini Books Podcast, and subscribe for more great podcasts like this one. But the description, it was designed to kind of subtly play into those engineer stereotypes.
Even though, statistically speaking, there were probably way more people studying, like history or English.
Exactly. But people, they ignored the numbers. They went with the story, even if it wasn't logical.
Humans are strange.
We are. And it just shows how easily we fall into this trap of, like, preferring a good narrative over cold, hard data.
It's like when you hear a conspiracy theory and you're like, that kind of makes sense, even when, deep down, it probably doesn't.
Right. It's that feeling that it feels true even if it's not. And speaking of illogical, that reminds me of the Linda problem. This one always throws people for a loop. Remember Linda? Outgoing, politically active.
Oh, right. And people thought she was more likely to be a feminist bank teller than just a bank teller, right?
Yes.
But hold on. How can someone be more likely to be two things at once? Isn't that, like, statistically impossible?
You'd think so, right? But this is what's called the conjunction fallacy. Our brains just gravitate towards a more exciting, more detailed story, even if it defies logic.
It's like our brains don't like to do math sometimes.
Right. What's even funnier is that even when you point this out to people, some will be like, yeah, so what's your point?
Yeah, it's like they just can't let go of that first impression, even when they know it's wrong.
Exactly. It's deeply ingrained. But that's, I think, why it's so important to, learn about these biases, because if we don't understand how these mental shortcuts work, we end up making decisions based on, bad logic.
Totally. Which, okay, perfect segue, because this reminds me of another one of those quirks Kahneman talks about, the anchoring effect. Even knowing about this one, it still blows my mind.
It is pretty wild.
It really is. So for those who haven't heard of it, break it down for us.
Okay, so the basic idea is you get exposed to a number, any number, even if it's totally random and has nothing to do with anything.
Okay.
That number, it becomes an anchor.
An anchor.
Like, it subtly influences your estimates about something else, even if those two things are totally unrelated.
Okay, I need an example because my brain's not making the connection here.
Okay. Imagine someone asks you to guess the year Gandhi died. Right before you answer, they spin this wheel with numbers on it, totally random, and it lands on, like, 142. Now, that number has nothing to do with Gandhi, right?
Yeah.
But studies show that just seeing that number, it'll probably influence your guess.
Wait, you're telling me I might guess a year closer to 142?
Yeah.
Even though I know that's way off.
It's weird, right?
That's so strange.
Our brains, they latch onto that anchor, even if it makes no sense.
It's like our brains just need to find patterns.
They do, even if there isn't one. And this applies to all kinds of decisions, from, like, figuring out a salary to buying a car, even something as simple as choosing a bottle of wine at a restaurant.
So what do you do? Like, how do you fight that? Become hyper-aware of every number you see?
It's not easy, but awareness is a good first step. When you're making a decision, especially about numbers, try to notice if there are any potential anchors floating around in your brain.
This is seriously making me question
Yeah.
everything.
Well, it just goes to show how easily our brains can be tricked.
For real.
But hey, that's why we're talking about this, right? Understanding these biases, that's how we start to overcome them. That's what I love about Kahneman's work. It gives us the tools to be more aware, more in control of our own thinking.
Totally. We've covered so much ground already. This battle between our gut instincts and our logical side, the weird world of heuristics and biases, it's a lot.
Speaking of potentially irrational choices, can we talk about loss aversion? Like, I feel like anyone who's ever sold a stock too early or held on to a ratty old t-shirt for way too long,
Oh, yeah.
they know what I'm talking about.
It's a powerful bias.
Yeah.
Loss aversion. It basically means feeling the pain of a loss way more strongly than the pleasure of like an equal gain.
Right, right. It's like that whole, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all.
Oh, wow.
Except with stuff.
And
Money.
Exactly. And Kahneman, he illustrates this so well with that experiment with the mugs. Oh, right. The mug experiment.
Yeah.
Where like half the people got a mug and then had to say how much they'd sell it for.
Right.
And the other half had to say how much they'd pay for it. And it's crazy how differently they valued the same mug.
It is wild. The sellers, they always want way more than the buyers are willing to pay, just owning the thing. Even for like 5 minutes, suddenly it's a prized possession.
It's so true. It's like this old thing, priceless.
Right. And it gets even weirder because this whole loss aversion thing, it makes us super vulnerable to framing effects.
Okay, framing effects. That sounds familiar, but remind me.
Okay, so framing is basically how the way information is presented.
The frame.
Yes, it can totally change our choices, even if the underlying options are exactly the same.
Okay, I need an example. Hit me.
Okay, so imagine you've got a serious illness,
Mm-hmm.
and your doctor presents 2 treatment options. Option A, there's a 30% chance you'll die. Option B, there's a 70% chance you'll live.
Okay, but those are like the same odds.
They're exactly the same, but studies show people will choose option B every time.
Just because it sounds better.
Because it's framed in terms of gains, of survival. Our brains, they don't like to think about losing.
Wow. So just changing the wording like totally changes our whole perspective.
Exactly. Advertisers, they use this stuff all the time. A product that's 90% fat-free sounds way better than one that contains 10% fat, even if they're the same thing.
It's true. I fall for that every time.
We all do. It's how our brains are wired. And this actually leads us to another really interesting idea that Kahneman talks about. The difference between our remembering self and our experiencing self.
Oh, right, right. It's like how you can have a vacation that's like kind of a disaster, delayed flights, bad weather.
Right.
But then you get home and you're like, that was amazing.
Exactly. Because what you're remembering are the highlights, the peak moments. You forget about all the annoying stuff in between.
So our memories, they're basically just highlight reels.
Pretty much. And that's Kahneman's point. Our experiencing self, it lives in the present moment, but then our remembering self comes in later and tries to make sense of it all.
Interesting. So how does that actually affect our decision-making, though? Like, are we constantly chasing those peak moments, even if they don't represent the whole picture?
It's a good question. And Kahneman, he talks about this study where they had people do this really unpleasant thing, sticking their hand in ice water.
Okay, not my idea of fun, but go on.
Right. So they had 2 options. Hold your hand in ice water for 60 seconds, or hold your hand in the ice water for 60 seconds, but then keep it there for another 30 seconds while the water slowly warms up.
So both options, you're dealing with that initial, like, shock of the cold.
Exactly. But the second one is longer overall. And guess what? People chose the longer one.
Wait, really? They chose more pain. Why?
Because the ending, with the water warming up, it created a less negative memory. Their remembering self, it kind of overrode the experiencing self.
That's wild. So even when it comes to something like physical pain, our memories, they're not always reliable.
Not even a little bit. And it just goes to show how important it is to be aware of these biases because they really do influence our choices in some pretty surprising ways.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot. We've got these 2 systems duking it out in our heads, system 1 and system 2. We've got all these heuristics, these mental shortcuts that can lead us astray. And to top it all off, our memories are basically just making stuff up half the time.
It sounds pretty bleak when you put it like that.
Right. So, like, what are we supposed to do with all of this? What's the takeaway?
Well, the good news is awareness is a huge first step. Just knowing about these biases makes us less likely to fall prey to them.
Okay, so knowledge is power.
Exactly. And Kahneman, he offers some really practical strategies too. Like one thing he talks about is adopting an outside view when we're making plans.
So instead of being like, oh yeah, I can totally renovate my kitchen in a weekend.
Right.
Maybe I should talk to someone who's actually done it and get a reality check.
Exactly. Another thing is checklists.
Checklists.
I know, they sound super boring.
They do.
But they work. Studies show that checklists, they actually outperform experts in a lot of fields, especially when things get complicated.
Okay, so checklists.
Yeah.
Not sexy, but effective.
Got it. Exactly. Yeah. And then another really useful strategy is to try reframing your decisions. If you're really stuck, try flipping it around and think about the opposite choice.
Oh, interesting. So, like, if I'm debating taking a new job, imagine I already have the job, and then ask myself, would I regret it?
Exactly. Reframing can help you break free from that initial emotional pull and make a more rational decision.
I love it. This has been incredible. I feel like I have a whole new vocabulary for understanding how my own mind works, and hopefully how to outsmart some of those pesky biases that are always trying to trip me up.
That's what it's all about.
So listeners, there you have it. The wild world of thinking fast and slow. Hopefully you're as fascinated by this stuff as I am. Now go forth and start noticing those cognitive quirks in your own life. You might be surprised by what you find. And remember, understanding how your mind works, that's the first step to making smarter choices, achieving your goals, and maybe even understanding yourself a little better along the way. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.
Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to dive into more book insights and key learnings, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Mini Books Podcast, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We're back every Sunday at 9 a.m. with new books and more to learn from. Until next time, take care, keep learning, and keep growing. Remember, this is Mini Books Podcast.